Great. So, yes, hi, my name's Ken Westin. Today I'm going to be talking about every contact leaves a trace. I'm going to talk about some of the investigations that I've been part of. I've been involved in security for a little over 15 years now. Again, I live on the Oregon coast. I currently work for a company called Panther. We're a modern SIM. I'm not sure if anyone doing the purple teaming workshop with me today. Anyone? Okay, I got one person in the workshop. Great. So we'll be doing some fun things with some SIM and some investigations and running defensive operations on Okta. So it's going to be a lot of fun. If you have space, recommend you show up. I've been involved in security for the last 15 years, but prior to working for various vendors, I've really liked doing investigations. So I've worked for companies like Splunk, Elastic. I really like the analytics space, and really trying to do deep dive investigations, particularly with a lot of times pieces of data that people may not consider forensic artifacts and things like that. So I'm going to talk about some investigations that I've done where I've actually unveiled organized crime rings, and also talk about how some of these tools and techniques that I've used can also be used against you. One of the challenges I think that we have right now is that a lot of marketing, especially in the US, they have a lot of information around you. So when information gets compromised, it actually makes you a bigger target, and a lot of people aren't aware of some of that. So this is what I kind of refer to as my wall of shame. So these are photos of people that I've actually put in prison. I had some technology that I was actually tracking stolen devices. So it was a kind of fun little startup where you deploy an agent, and then if it got stolen, you'd activate a web camera. I would get location from Wi-Fi networks, do all really fun things. And along the way, I ended up getting really heavily involved in helping law enforcement. I know you guys may not believe this, but sometimes law enforcement are incredibly lazy, and a lot of times they don't have some of the resources or some of the tools to be able to conduct some of these investigations. And sometimes they would piss me off, and so that's when I would go out and I would try to dig a little bit deeper. So I would gather more information around some of my targets, and as a result of that, I ended up unveiling organized crime rings. There was a lot of Russian organized crime groups, in particular, in where I live, and they would fence stolen property, a bunch of other things that they were doing that were pretty nasty. So I did a presentation around this at DEF CON 23. And of course, the talk, I titled it, Confessions of a Professional Cyber Stalker. I thought it was being funny. But of course, the BBC then says, hey, I'm a professional cyber stalker. And they put this big face up there. Motherboard called me the real life Mr. Robot. So if you ever want to become a dox target, get these kind of headlines. It's all horse crap. I'm not that great of a hacker. I'm actually incredibly lazy. You'll kind of see that. So I'm kind of curious. Does anyone know who this is? This photo? Has anyone ever taken a forensics class? Like not digital forensics, but like real forensics? All right. So this is Edmond Lecard. So Edmond Lecard was sort of the forensic, the grandfather of forensic science. They refer to him in France as the French, a great investigator, right? Sherlock Holmes, the French Sherlock Holmes. So he actually developed a lot of the concepts that we have for forensic science today. This is before DNA. He was born in 1877. This is before DNA and fingerprints and all that stuff. But a lot of the things that he was telling us about forensic science are things that we learned. And he has this concept, and it's called Lecard's exchange principle. And it's every contact leaves a trace. Now, the idea behind this is that when someone commits a crime, let's say a murder, the idea is that they leave something behind, but they also take something with them. And what I found true when I started reading about this guy, I was like, this carries over so much into the digital world. The trick is, how do we know where that data might reside? There's always a way, there's always a trace, there's always something in a log that we can actually identify a suspect. There's got to be a way for us to do it when someone's committing a digital crime, what have you. And I'm finding that this is even more so now. We have IoT, we carry our devices with us everywhere. Pretty much any sort of investigation into a crime that's happening now is going to have a digital or a forensics component. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you're going to commit a crime, make sure you leave your cell phone at home. So you kind of think about this. I kind of think about this as like the quantified cell phone. You think about all the pieces of data that you actually have. about you. And they're sort of these little artifacts. You have your social security number in the US. You have, these device IDs, phone numbers, MAC addresses. You think about all these little pieces of information out there, and we're actually leaving trails of this. Every single device that we have, our watches, all of our maybe home automation systems that we have, like everything that we're doing here, we're actually leaving a digital exhaust trail as well. The trick is being able to try to connect some of those dots when we're conducting investigations. So everyone here has seen these kind of things in your investigation, like your CSI, right? They're called crazy walls. So it's great to have all these little pieces of information, but you really need to be able to connect those dots. And what I found is once you can connect one dot, it may be part of another dot, that's when investigations really start to unveil themselves, and you can actually get a lot of information about a particular individual or a particular group. You guys are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You might also be familiar with the pyramid of pain with TTPs. So I figured in InfoSec we all like our pyramids, right? So this is what I like to refer to as the hierarchy of data bleed. So it starts at the top as data that we create. So it used to be, back in the day before the cloud, when we had our computers, we had software we would run on our computer called Microsoft Office, and it would be Word, and we would generate that. We would generate these documents. We wouldn't necessarily be sharing with them, but that's information there. As soon as I upload that or I email that, that's when, there's additional logs and traces that get associated with it. But when we're interacting with websites and applications and APIs, what happens is there's actually data that gets created for us. What happens here is as we start to move down this hierarchy, our control of that data gets lost. Particularly when we start to get further down the spire here, when we get into data created about us. So when I go and I buy a plane ticket, right, a lot of information gets sent to them, to the airline. The airline maybe cross-references some of that information with no-fly lists. There's a lot of places where this information is actually getting shared in almost real time. And then we have shadow data. And that's where a lot of times we have data that gets compromised in data breaches. We have sometimes that information is collected for us from like credit bureaus, all sorts of information, data brokers. People always talk about doxing back in the day as a form of hacking. Nowadays, the only tool you really need to dox anyone is called a credit card. That's all you need to be able to get information about particular individuals. So if you get access to this information, whether it's from data brokers or if it's compromised data, maybe from a breach, you can actually, search for that information in the dark web, and get access to, again, a lot of information that you shouldn't really have. But if you really are wanting to learn something about someone, their passwords, there's all these sorts of things, it's very easy information to get nowadays, which could scare the crap out of all of us. So how I got started with a lot of this stuff was I was working for a company. I was sort of a one-man web army. I was building their websites. I ended up having to secure the web servers. That was sort of my introduction to security, just basically securing a LAMP server. The company I worked for, they then started selling a tool that would actually block USB flash drives. There was an issue now, like, great, we're securing the perimeter, but if I can plug a flash drive into a computer, I can install Trojans, I can do all sorts of interesting things with stealing data. And this tool that they were selling would actually block that and give you more control over who would be able to download or use those particular tools. And so I got really interested in a lot of the Black Hat tools that were out there. So I started downloading them, playing with them, started creating some of my own. And I thought, it'd be really great to build a website to raise awareness around this because this is a big issue. Very easy for me to download these tools, put it on a flash drive, plug it into a flash drive or a network, and I can compromise the entire thing. You guys ever heard of a little spyware or a piece of malware called Stuxnet? Yeah, that's one of the attack vectors with a USB flash drive. I happen to work for some people that were involved in that. So I wanted to create this. Just the idea here was to raise awareness, right? I didn't want to go out and show like, here's a bunch of hacking tools, go do crime. I wanted to raise awareness to administrators. So I created a website called USB Hacks, where I would upload some of these tools, explain how they work, started creating my own. That was the first time the FBI contacted me. they wanted to know what the hell I was doing. Once they realized, this is about raising awareness. And I even had situations where I had people that were true cyber criminals. I think they were nation state actors actually reaching out to me, asking me how to set up certain things. It sounded like sometimes they actually had an insider in some of these facilities, and they were looking for help in how to compromise networks. I just forwarded those on to the FBI right away. Like, hey, see, like I'm helping you. I ended up collaborating with them on a lot of investigations later on. This doesn't work. There we go. So basically what I did was I decided to take some of the malware that was being written, and I was working on my master's dissertation at the time, and I was like, there's got to be a way to turn this into a good thing. And I started messing around with a lot of my friends. I would be putting these flash drives on, or the malware on flash drives and send it to my friends, see them plug it in. I'd send all this other information that I was able to get about their computer. And I said, hey, I'm going to put this out there and see if people are interested in this for theft recovery purposes. So if someone steals a flash drive or an external drive, the idea here is it has this USB Trojan. You plug it into the computer. It hijacks the computer. It's connected to when you try to access the drive, and it sends information to the mothership, the username, the IP address, and things like that. I was just curious. I put it up on dig.com. So for those of you who are young, it's like Reddit for old people, like back in the day. It got on the homepage, and it got dug to death. I had like 20,000 people sign up for this free service. And what was awesome about this is I was basically crowdsourcing what devices were actually supported, because I had a little bit of code in there that would actually tell me what devices were being accessed. So I found that it was working with external flash drives. I found it was working with the old school GPS devices. I know it's hard to believe that it wasn't actually in your car, just kind of letting you guys know how old I am. But I even had the specific models and everything. And then that's when I decided I was actually going to do a little startup around some of this stuff. And it actually worked. I started actually getting people that were installing it on like iPods, and there would be people would change their usernames and their family. This was very easy for us to identify who actually stole the iPod. Most stuff was like high school kids, things like that, screwing around with this stuff. And then it got pretty serious. I got one case where a university professor had installed it on his flash drive where he had his PhD dissertation, and he had a student that looks like they stole the flash drive off of his desk. And it was difficult because initially we were getting just an IP pings from just AT&T, like an ISP. It's very difficult to get information just from an IP address unless you have law enforcement involved to actually fill out all the paperwork. And again, I'm lazy, and a lot of law enforcement are lazy, so we don't want to deal with that. But I started getting additional connections from the University of North Texas. And then I contacted their campus security and their IT folks, and they worked with me. We were able to identify that in that particular IP range, it was actually one specific computer lab. The year prior, they'd actually had a bunch of laptops stolen, or computers stolen out of that particular lab. So they actually installed cameras, and they also had these sort of card swipers. So I was able to give them the time when this occurred, the computer that was affected, and we're able to figure out specifically who was actually in that room at that time. And there was only 2 or 3 students, and they were able to narrow it down to 1. They waited outside of a class as he was leaving, and they were able to get the flash drive back. But it was just an interesting thing is that we had IP address, but it wasn't until we had access to all this other information. We had video of the person doing their card swipe, right? So we had plenty of evidence to identify who specifically that was. And then I kind of got a lot of noise in the media, and there's this company called FLIR. Anyone heard of FLIR before? They make very high-end thermal imaging cameras. These cameras cost anywhere from like $3,000 to $300,000. And they were really interested in this, not just for theft recovery. They wanted to offer it as a sort of a premium service, but also they were having issues with export controls. These are devices that are not allowed to be, they're embargoed into certain countries because they can be used for nuclear purposes. And they were running into situations where these cameras were showing up in places they shouldn't, and they wanted to see if they can utilize my technology to solve it. One challenge we had, though, is that the agent would get installed on the SD card. And one thing is if someone rips the SD card out and then puts a new one in, right, the agent's gone. So I actually work with them to actually embed something in the firmware. So it would actually look for the SD card if it was new. Is the agent been deployed? If not, redeploy the agent along with some other files. And then I disguise the executable. That's my cat, Nobby. There's a thermal image camera. So that's what I disguise the application as. And they ended up using this for quite a few cases. They got a few cases where it was stolen. They couldn't tell me specifically where, but they did also track down a couple of cases where devices were being sold by a particular distributor that were going to countries that they shouldn't be selling. They couldn't give me all the details because, of course, investigations, but it did work. So that was the important thing. So then I started getting interested more in, okay, the flash drives are great, but what about laptops? I started looking at the time, and they actually had a company called, it was like LoJack for laptops. It was a company by CompuTrace. They actually licensed the name. And I was looking at how they were actually doing their theft recovery, and it was incredibly invasive. And basically, when you have this technology, you provide a backdoor into your computer, and they hire like ex-law enforcement folks. And then if it gets stolen, then they can log into your computer, and they can do various things for tracking it. And I was like, there's got to be a different way. At that time, the first iPhone was just being released, and I noticed that it didn't have a GPS chip, but it was able to get location. What they were able to do is use Wi-Fi location, and so I contacted the company that made it, called Skyhook, and I said, I have this idea. I want to apply this for theft recovery purposes for Macs. Will you work with me? And they gave me access to the API, and we set it up so that if someone steals your laptop, we'll activate tracking. And I didn't want to have a server at this time. I didn't want to have to deal with like photos, being sent to my server. Then I have to secure it. Again, I'm lazy. I don't want to deal with that. And it's also a big issue if someone does get compromise that server. There's certain liabilities associated with that when I can activate someone's web camera and send a photo every 30 minutes, right? So I integrate with Flickr. So if you sign up for your Flickr account, you download the software, and then you would activate tracking. That's all you would do on our end. And then it would send photos. It would send the GPS coordinates to your Flickr account. And it actually worked. We actually ended up getting my first recovery. It was it was in New York. It was an iMac. Not only was the iMac stolen, but a bunch of camera equipment was also stolen from someone's apartment, and we activated tracking. And I was getting these photos, and you'll see in the background here, there's a lot of other interesting toys like mixers, guitars. You got all these musical instruments, almost like a pawn shop. And I had to work with law enforcement on this one, and it was this cop from New York. He was kind of an asshole. Sorry, I shouldn't swear, but he was a real jerk. And he's like, I haven't had to deal with this stuff before. I've dealt with this CompuTrace jokes. I have to get this IP address. I got to go fill all this paperwork out to get information from the ISP. And I'm like, no. This is a wholly different approach. Like I got the Wi-Fi positioning is within 10 to 20 meters of where it actually is. And then all you need to do is just print a photo out here, just ask around. And he's like, don't tell me how to do my job. I was like, okay, just do it. And of course he did it. And come to find out, it was actually a tattoo parlor, and this was the owner. And this is the office in the back. They went in and they actually ended up recovering all sorts of other stolen property. He was running a fencing operation out of the back of his tattoo parlor. And there was like 4 or 5 other laptops that were recovered in this one. So that one I said we had a 500% recovery rate. But that was the first one that we had. And then there was a bunch of other ones that we had. In Portland, Oregon, where I live, we had a bunch of schools that kept getting robbed of laptops. So I worked with the school district. I said, hey, here, let's set up some bait laptops. So what would happen is they would get laptops stolen, then a week later they would get new ones, and then that weekend they would get stolen again. I was like, you guys really need to up your security system in the schools. And so what we did, we set a bunch of bait laptops. We didn't lock them up or anything. We just had them laying out. Sure enough, they got robbed, and I was able to trace it to a particular house. And I gave that information to the police. They went there, and I told them it was within 10 to 20 meters. I go, it's not going to be exact, GPS coordinates. It's going to give you the general area. The police officer shows up, and the guy that answers the door, it's the guy that does his roof. And he's like, you have no idea what you're talking about. You just wasted all of our time. And I got pissed off. So I went out there, and I had my laptop. I had my Alpha. I was sniffing out the Wi-Fi signals. I wanted to make sure that it was valid. And I go out there, and I'm right here. actually, across the street from where it was. And I look over, and the Wi-Fi network I kept seeing was like Russian Pride kind of thing. And I look over, and there's a car with a bumper sticker that says Russian Pride on the bumper sticker. And it was there was a duplex. It was the house right next to where the police had gone. And so I'm sitting there with my, like a nerd, just like my antenna sticking out of my car. And then this guy walks out, this person, and he's looked right at my car. And I'm like, I'm panicking. I started looking at my laptop like I'm looking for directions. And then I finally called the detective. I told him the situation. And they ended up getting in there, and there was 6 or 7 people that were actually involved in this organized crime ring. And then he goes, yeah, like, you know, some of these guys are really bad. Like, not this guy, but the guy that lives across the street that's his friend. He just got out of jail for like manslaughter. And I was like, you mean where my car was parked? Thanks. But yeah, we ended up busting them. It was funny. I thought I was going to have to, around this time, I thought I was going to have to go to court and like, you know, say who I was, in front of a bunch of Russian organized crime groups. I was getting a little nervous around people with Adidas tracksuits. But they ended up getting them to all think that they all turned on each other. So they ended up all ratting each other out. So I didn't have to go to court. That was nice. And so I had another one. This time we had a laptop that was stolen, and I wasn't getting any connections for like 2 weeks. I'm like, great. They ripped out the hard drive, reformatted it, like, you know, we'll never see it again. But then 2 weeks later, I started getting pings, and it was very far away from where it was originally. It was out in Missouri. And I started seeing that there's this kid, and he was nice enough to change the username on the computer to his full name. So I had his first and last name. I started doing a lot of research on him. Like I had all these photos of him. Like there was even a photo of him in a hotel with a girl behind him, kind of a sketchy situation. All sorts of interesting things that he was doing. And then I also found out that he was really into cars. And so I found his MySpace. He was a power seller on eBay. He was selling car parts. Right. So kind of get you an idea of what he's doing, like stealing car parts and selling them online. And the nice thing is he's really into Scion cars, and so he's all these forums. And so I found a bunch of photos of his car. So I also had his license plate number. That was really nice. In this case, I actually worked with the DA. We had enough evidence they said, even if he doesn't have the laptop, this is enough evidence for us to get him for possession of stolen property. What happened was when stuff gets stolen, they would actually load it up into a truck in Portland, Oregon, and then they would send it to Missouri, and then they would exchange stolen property. Because the first place you're going to look when your laptop gets stolen is your local Craigslist, right? That's why they were trying to evade that. And the guy that gave him his laptop was actually Victor's father. He was the one that's sort of the leader of this whole group, and he had given him his son a stolen laptop for his birthday, as well as a stolen bike. And then Victor sold the bike and the laptop to his friend Omar here. That's Omar there. So we were able to, again, we ended up getting this back. There was probably another 7 or 8 people that were involved in this particular case. But this is where I started getting more like kind of OSINT. I started doing more investigations, digging more into the profiles of some of these individuals. I had another one that was actually international. This was an interesting one. There was 2 guys. This guy was actually a veterinary student. He had a laptop in the back of the car. They were held at gunpoint, and they had a carjacking. And they beat the crap out of the driver almost to death. And then they took off with the car and the laptop. And we were getting photos, and the police in Brazil were really interested in this because I guess these people were involved in a number of these cases. And they ended up going in there, and they were able to catch these guys that were doing these very rather violent acts. So again, they didn't necessarily know they were stealing a laptop that was Trojanized with my software, but we were able to catch these people that were actually assaulting individuals. Then I started getting more into smartphones. I was more interested not just in necessarily tracking them, because a lot of times people don't care about the value of the device. What they care about is the data. And so I built a tool to actually back up and encrypt data, and it would do it in such a way that I wouldn't even have access to that information. If the police came to me and say, hey, we need this person's backup of their photos and their contact information, I go, here's the encrypted blob. You have to go to them for the PIN because I don't know it. There's no way, like, even if they hacked into our server, like, and they download the data, there's no way that they would be able to make any sense of it unless they had some of these keys. So it was a cool technology. It was a startup I had. It was a failed startup, but hey, at least we got to build some cool technology. But here's a little video. I actually ended up making a deal with a wireless chain of stores. They actually deployed the technology to their demo units because they were getting stolen quite a bit. And we had a really interesting case. So I'm going to stop talking so you guys can watch a video.
That's helping track them down. News Channel 8's Ed Teachout spent the past 2 days with police and investigators on the trail of swiped cell phones. He's live outside the Washington Square Mall where the theft took place.
Well, the managers of the Sprint store here at the Washington Square Mall behind me say they're very confident that tracking software developed only miles away from here and put onto their demo phones will lead to an arrest.
This is a $500 phone. This ended up being a $450 phone.
2 empty display cradles are all that remains after someone stole 2 demo cell phones from the Sprint store at Washington Square Mall on Saturday. Moments after surveillance video caught the theft on tape, employees initiated tracking software installed on the stolen phones.
We were able to not only find the GPS location of the individuals that took them, but also we've been able to monitor any activity that happens in the phone.
That activity turned out to be pictures someone took shortly after the phones were stolen. Tigard police admit it's a brave new world when pictures taken on cell phones can be told to send back pictures once they're stolen.
And that has not only piqued the interest of our investigators, but in essence appears at this point could be very credible information for us to follow up on.
The Portland creator of the software tracking the theft says police are on the right track.
If they're not the thieves, they definitely know who stole it.
And if you look over the head of this man, you'll see in the window an Oregon temporary permit.
Philip, this is Ed.
With the help of a gadget track investigator on the phone, we tracked the stolen phone signal to this Vancouver apartment complex. There we found the exact temporary permit and a young woman who told us off camera a man she called Peter had sent this photo to her Saturday evening, but says she knew nothing about the phones.
Hi, my name's Ed.
We tracked the second cell phone signal to this duplex about 8 blocks away.
You don't have a Samsung Epic phone in this location?
No. Police were here yesterday looking for it.
We're back live now outside the Washington Square Mall where we've just obtained within the hour the DMV records on that temporary permit. Tigard police say they hope the men in the pictures will contact them soon so they can explain how their faces ended up on a stolen cell phone. Back to you.
Thank you, Ed Teachout. The contractors accused...
That's helping track them down.
There you go. So that was a fun case. And that was another one where they got like half a dozen people. They actually did recover a stolen car. It wasn't that one, but there was another car that was stolen that they recovered in the process. And it was another kind of Russian organized crime group that was doing that. So kind of with this too, I was really nervous about some of the things that we were doing with some of the mobile spyware. But the thing is, like, people would install it on their own devices. That was the big thing, is like, you install this on devices you own. We're not trying to hide it. We're not doing anything like that, like stalkerware. That was a big concern of mine. But I see a lot of stuff that's happening right now, particularly in the malware space. And you guys are probably familiar with NSO Group and the Pegasus spyware. So this is a kind of a scary shift, I think, in spyware, where you have people that are building commercial spyware, leveraging zero-day exploits, and they're targeting people that are innocent. It's one thing if you're targeting criminals with some of this technology, but there's a real concern now where if you're targeting dissidents or you're targeting journalists, which is the case here, it's a big concern. So I've been pretty heavily involved in trying to fight some of this stuff. So I'm pretty against this approach. One thing I've found is that a lot of times when organizations may rely on some of this technology, if they rely on spyware for their investigation, it truly is a sign of lazy investigations. It means that they have no other means to identify some of these suspects, and they're going to need additional information anyway. But just my belief is I think that we've sort of opened a Pandora's box when it comes to this, and it's something I think we need to be really careful of. So kind of interesting is that, we got a lot of information from some of those images. So, we had a trip permit on the back, right? That was really helpful. So sometimes, especially when you're dealing with criminals, two of the key main vulnerabilities I run into were stupidity, or I guess arrogance and greed. Those are the two main things. They think that they're always going to get away with it, or they get greedy. Those are the two things that usually get them caught. And so I was really interested in this too, because when we were getting some of the GPS coordinates, a lot of times it wasn't very accurate from some of these phones. But what was more accurate was the GPS coordinates that got embedded in some of the images. And that's what actually led to us to tracking these folks down. And so I started getting more interested in the EXIF image data that's actually embedded in these images. And I went down another rabbit hole. I actually found that a lot of higher end cameras like Canon, things like that, they actually embed the make, model, and the serial number of the camera that took the photo in the image itself. At the time, there wasn't really a way to search for that. So I was screwing around and I started building a little database. I had a crappy little Python script that would go out to Flickr, download the image, it would extract the information and put it into a database. But I looked at it like it was like 5 billion images in Flickr at the time, and I was like, this is going to take forever. There's no way I'm going to be able to do this with just me. At the time, I had a friend that had a startup, and it was sort of like this sort of distributed computing concept, Steady at Home. You guys ever seen those? It was like that, but you would basically, you would give out your idle computer time, and we'll run projects on those computers, and we'll pay you for it. And they had access to over like 500 computers in various computer labs around the country. And so I got to deploy my script to it, and we mined basically all of Flickr within a week. So I had this database, and then I put it out in the media. Like, you can do a search for the serial number of your camera, and then it'll show you all the images I found online that took that from that camera. It wasn't just Flickr. I found it with a bunch of other photo sharing websites. I also found Twitter. Even though they'll scrub the EXIF data from images you upload, I found a lot of the profile pictures had the EXIF data still in it. So you had these tiny little like icons, and I was finding all kinds of information like GPS coordinates, like serial numbers, all this other stuff. So it was really interesting project. And this ended up working as well. There was a guy, he was actually a photographer that was on assignment for Getty Images, John Heller. And he turned around and $9,000 worth of camera equipment were gone. His bag was gone. And he heard about this search engine I built. This is a year after it was stolen. And he contacted me and he goes, we got a hit. And he found that there was a photographer on Flickr. He was also then able to see his Facebook profile, and that he was a professional photographer, and he had all of his camera equipment on a bed here in a photo, and he goes, that's my camera right there. And so what happened was the camera got stolen. It got sold to someone on Craigslist. And then that person sold it to someone on eBay, and that's the guy that actually had it. He wasn't the criminal, but he did have to hire a lawyer because he was in possession of stolen property. He had explained the whole scenario. They went back to the eBay seller. He felt bad. He gave him a refund, and then he told the police where he actually got this on Craigslist, and they even had the address of the apartment. This is a year later. The police go to that apartment. Sure enough, they go in there, and there's all sorts of stolen property that are in this apartment. Another fencing operation was unveiled. So I think this is interesting because one little piece of information that was embedded in an image led to the unveiling of this larger crime that we've identified. And I had a bunch of other like this too. There was another one where it was in Virginia. A guy, he was showing this really nice camera to someone. He's about to move to California, and he's out in the garage, and the guy just like shows him the cash, and then let's go look at the camera. Shows him the camera, and then pops him in the face, grabs the camera, and takes off in a car. We started researching this guy, and it was funny as he changed his camera every like 1 or 2 months. He had a different camera. I had all these different serial numbers. I also found some of his other photos, like he did some where he was going 120 miles an hour down the freeway while he's smoking weed with his girlfriend. He also had an unlicensed firearm he liked to take photos of himself with. So I provided all of this to law enforcement. And this was interesting. It's like they weren't really interested in following up. I mean, we had GPS coordinates of where they were smoking weed and going 120 miles an hour. But this was a case where the police just didn't want to get involved at all. So we didn't actually get any recovery, but it was really interesting, again, combining sort of the telemetry I was getting with the EXIF data, and then also adding some OSINT on top of that. Again, I was able to show and unveil sort of the crime that was actually committed. The EXIF tool, I got reached out to by ICE. There's a group, they do Child Exploitation Investigations Unit. And they're doing some really cool stuff, like where they're even logging, photos of hotels. Like what curtain patterns look like? What do the rug look like? What does the bedspread look like? So in a situation, if they get an image, where there might be a child that's about to be exploited, they can say that is in California, that's such and such chain. They can actually identify it before it actually becomes an issue. And so I gave them access to this API for free. They can't tell me if they actually utilize it. They said it was helpful. But the idea here is that if Joe Pervert, he's doing this sort of thing and he goes on vacation with his family, he's taking photos at Disneyland, uploads it to Flickr, and we're able to get a connection, like that same camera was used in these innocent image crimes, then they'd be able to hopefully stop some of this before it happens. Again, I'm not sure if it was actually caught any bad guys, but it felt pretty good that they found that it was a useful tool for them. So. And then, I was thinking about this too. When actually I presented some of this stuff when I was at DEF CON, I had a lot of media that reached out to me. And one of them, they actually wanted us to hack a smart home. There was a lot of, smart homes were sort of new back then. And there was a lot of vulnerabilities with it. And they said, can you come in? What we want you to do is we'll give you 24 hours. You can hack the smart home. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a party. We're going to invite a bunch of people to the house. And then you got to mess with people. And I'm like, sign me up. Let's go. So here's another video.
Vicki Johnson's new beachfront house is not only spectacular, it's smart. She can control most everything from her phone or tablet.
It's pretty smart. The drapes go up and down automatically. We can close doors. We can flush toilets. We can turn lights on and off. We can turn the air conditioning on and off. TVs, music. It's a brilliant house. We were told it was hack-proof.
We'll see about that.
They think they're coming to take a tour of a smart house.
But what we're really doing is hacking her house during the party and potentially the devices of every guest who walks through the front door. Helping me are two cybersecurity experts, Craig Young and Ken Westin.
So first we need to break into the Wi-Fi.
Vicki has 28 devices connected to the home's wireless internet. Once they were into the Wi-Fi system, our hackers were quickly able to commandeer the home's cameras.
These are the security cameras to the house that you've hacked into.
Exactly. Here we actually can see this is actually our car out here. This is the front door. If you don't secure them properly, then they become insecurity cameras.
First, we turn off the lights.
What is going on?
Then, with control of the security cameras, we divert the video signal and play it on the TV in the living room. What? With everyone's attention on the TV, the hackers talk to the guests.
We have taken control of this house, the lights, the security cameras.
Now a special message from me in the car is piped in. I'm Anna Garcia from Crime Watch Daily, and this house has just been hacked.
It was free or cheap for the people that are actually implementing the installation, but that poses a lot of security risks, as you can imagine.
So that was fun. What's funny is what led us to get into it is we sent a bunch of data. We actually use a cloud cracking service to actually crack the password, and we get it back. And I'm like, wait a minute, we spent like $200 on the service, and then I looked at it and was like, this looks like a phone number. I googled the phone number, and it's his cell phone number that he has on his website. He was selling real estate, so I was like, we could have saved $200. But the interesting thing with that, when we used the Wi-Fi pineapple for it, it was like default passwords for everything. That's why it was very easy to get into all the systems. They didn't show it, but I was actually able to flush the toilets too, because they had a cleaning mechanism. And so I would sit there and I kept flushing when people went to the bathroom. We ended up breaking their sound system too, which luckily we didn't have to pay for that. But we got into a bunch of stuff. That was actually a lot of fun. But it also shows a cell phone number for your Wi-Fi. If someone can get into your house. I also had access to a bunch of their file shares. He had, again, real estate, he had open file shares. They weren't protected at all. So we could have done a lot more, but we were very cautious about, how we're doing this, particularly because it was on TV.
Vicki Johnson's new beachfront house is...
Let's see here. Slide. So another thing I kind of did too when I was, it was an investigation I was working on where I kept tracking a laptop that ended up going to Mexico. We never got it back. It kept coming to California and it would go back over the border. We kept doing it. And I was able to get some information about a particular individual and I started doing searches for them. And then I stumbled into this thing where I was like, wait a minute, this is a prodigy. I actually can get into this person's email address without having any sort of authentication. And I found out that it was actually a vulnerability. There was Telmex had acquired Prodigy in Mexico, and there was a configuration on the server. So basically, all authentication were removed, and all of these emails were actually indexed by Google. So I did responsible disclosure. I told Google about it, and then I told a journalist I work with them about it, in the El Economista, and we were talking about this. And then there was a big article that was going to go out in a paper about this vulnerability because it was like thousands of people's emails that I had access to. I could have done all kinds of nefarious things. And then Carlos Slim, which is a very wealthy individual in Mexico and also contacts with a lot of media, he put the kibosh on that, so it never got in the main newspaper, but still counted as a win. So I did a little bit of vulnerability research. I also did some research into when I was investigating credit card fraud and carding and things like that. I found in like a dark web forums there was a lot of exchange of information for hackers, cyber criminals, and white collar criminals. At this time, cryptocurrency was becoming a lot more popular, and you actually had scenarios where people were actually advertising, "Hey, if you have insider knowledge that we can use to trade on stocks, we'll give you a percentage of it." And there was this case, and I kind of helped with this, where there was around $30 million in illicit trades that were being made. There was this guy, Dubovo Group. He used to be a VP at Morgan Stanley, and then he became a minister at a church, and he ended up going to jail for this. But this was interesting. This was like $30 million, and there was a recent one, another one with an FSB agent in Russia and other groups that were colluding with this, and they made around $80 million in illicit trades. But there's a couple of talks. If you do a search for black hats and white collars, you can read more about my research on this. But I just think it's kind of a fascinating topic. So again, kind of what we talked about a lot today was like how we're able to use small pieces of information to gather larger profiles. Everything I did, I've done is really tracking criminals. I don't go after innocent people. But you think about how a criminal can actually use some of these same data sets to target you. Also, authoritative regimes, they're using these sorts of piece of information as well to dox individuals. And so I think this is something we really need to be conscious of. All this EXIF data and stuff that I have access to, like they've removed all that, they scrub it. But what's interesting is the FBI, Twitter, all these social media platforms, do you think they throw that data away? No, they have access to it and they can use it for investigations. And again, if those services get compromised and a hacker, a cyber criminal gets access to that information, right, they can use that information against us. So that's one reason why I'm in cybersecurity now, is because I think we need to protect that data. Best way to protect the data is not to collect it in the first place. So I think we need to think about that in our risk models, but then also how do we better secure that information in general. And with that, if you guys want to learn more about how to protect your data, come to my workshop. Right. So I'll be teaching a purple teaming workshop later on today after lunch. But I really want to thank B-Sides Dublin for having me, and thank you so much.